Did you know that there is a version of the Bible so enigmatic that it was considered controversial and even dangerous? Today we're going to talk about the Septuagint, an ancient translation that changed the way the Bible is read, profoundly influencing Christianity and Judaism, and shaping the history of the West. Shrouded in mystery and controversy, the Septuagint challenges everything we think we know about the Scriptures, curious to understand why this text is still considered a threat by some. Stay with us until the end to discover how it has impacted religions and societies over the centuries. If you're interested in this fascinating topic, make sure to leave your like to support the channel and comment on what you think about this story. Your opinion is very important for us to keep exploring deep topics like this one. Introduction to the Septuagint, the book that shaped history. The Septuagint is one of the most influential and controversial translations in history, not only because it was the first Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, but because it transformed the way the Scriptures were interpreted and transmitted. Produced during a period of cultural and political transition in the Mediterranean, the Septuagint transcended its role as a mere translation. It became a powerful cultural and religious tool, shaping the thought of both Judaism and Christianity. Created in the context of the Jewish diaspora, the translation reflected the need to adapt the Scriptures to the new linguistic reality of Jews who no longer spoke Hebrew. Greek, the dominant language in the Hellenistic world after the conquests of Alexander the Great, became essential for the cultural and religious survival of these communities. The Septuagint filled this gap, allowing Jews to maintain their faith even in foreign lands. Its impact was especially felt in the nascent Christianity. For the early Christians, the Septuagint was fundamental for the interpretation of messianic prophecies and for spreading the message of Jesus. The Greek Bible became the predominant version used in the first Christian communities, who saw in it the confirmation of their beliefs. On the other hand, within Judaism, this translation sparked distrust. Many rabbis believed that the Septuagint did not do justice to the original Hebrew text, introducing translations that altered the meaning of essential passages. This tension reflected a deeper conflict over preserving Jewish identity in an increasingly Hellenized world. The production of the Septuagint is surrounded by legends. The most famous is the story that 72 Jewish scholars were summoned to translate the Torah into Greek, each working in isolation, but miraculously producing identical texts. This account, recorded in the letter of Aristeas, reinforced the divine aura surrounding the Septuagint, making it a work both revered and feared. As Christianity grew, the Septuagint became established as the official version of the Old Testament. This created even more tension between Jews and Christians, as the former viewed with suspicion the Christian interpretations based on this translation. Many Jewish leaders began to reject the Septuagint in favor of the Hebrew text, creating a division that would last for centuries. Beyond its religious role, the Septuagint was also a vehicle for cultural dissemination. By translating Jewish concepts into Greek, the translators inserted the Hebrew worldview into a Hellenistic context, influencing not only Judaism and Christianity, but also Greco-Roman philosophy. This interaction of cultures shaped Western civilization in profound ways. In summary, the Septuagint was not just a translation of the Bible, but a turning point in religious and cultural history. It allowed the Scriptures to transcend linguistic barriers, becoming accessible to a wider audience, but also sparked controversies that persist to this day. The mysterious origin. Who were the 70 translators? The story of the creation of the Septuagint is shrouded in legends that blend myths with historical facts. According to the most well-known tradition, King Ptolemy II Philadelphus, ruler of Egypt, wanted to add a Greek translation of the Torah to the famous Library of Alexandria. To do so, he is said to have requested the high priest Eleazar in Jerusalem to send scholars to undertake this task. According to the account in the letter of Aristeas, 72 wise men, 6 from each tribe of Israel, were sent to Egypt. They were allegedly placed in isolation and tasked with independently translating the Torah. The final result was astonishing. All of them produced identical translations, which many saw as a miracle, attributing the work to divine intervention. This legendary story helped solidify the image of the Septuagint as a sacred and miraculous text. Despite the mystery surrounding this story, modern scholars believe the translation process was far more complex and gradual. The translation of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, was likely completed in the early 3rd century BCE, but the translation of the other books of the Hebrew Bible occurred over the following years. Thus, the Septuagint was not a work completed all at once, but the result of several decades of labor. Alexandria, where the Septuagint was produced, was a cultural and intellectual center in the Hellenistic world. The city housed a large Jewish community, and many of the Jews there spoke Greek as their primary language. For these Jews, a translation of the Bible was a practical necessity to keep their faith alive amid a culture dominated by Hellenism. Beyond its religious significance, the translation also served a political purpose. Ptolemy II sought to strengthen his empire through knowledge of the cultures under his rule, and the inclusion of Jewish laws in the Library of Alexandria was part of this strategy. Therefore, the Septuagint can be seen not only as a religious work, but also as a product of the political dynamics of the time. The fact that the translation was carried out in Alexandria is significant. The city was a meeting point between East and West, where Greek and Jewish cultures intertwined. This cosmopolitan environment was essential for the creation of the Septuagint, which represents a fusion of these two traditions. However, the translation process faced challenges. Greek and Hebrew are very different languages, with distinct cultural and religious concepts. The translators had to make difficult decisions about how to adapt deeply Jewish concepts for a Greek audience. These translation choices were not neutral, and ultimately influenced how the scriptures were interpreted. Despite its legendary origins, the Septuagint became one of the most important works in religious history. It not only allowed Jewish scriptures to be read by a broader audience, but also contributed to the emergence of new religious understandings that shaped both Judaism and Christianity. The translation and its cultural impact. The translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, done by the Septuagint, had a profound cultural impact on the ancient world. Alexandria, the city where it was created, was a major cultural center of the Mediterranean, home to one of the largest libraries and a vibrant Jewish community. In this cosmopolitan environment, the translation was not just a matter of language, but a cultural adaptation that allowed Jews of the diaspora to maintain their religious identity. Greek, the dominant language of the Hellenistic Empire, was used in both commercial and intellectual spheres. Translating the scriptures into Greek meant making the sacred texts accessible to an audience that no longer spoke Hebrew. This was crucial for Hellenized Jews, who no longer had command of the original language of their religious texts. However, the translation of the Septuagint was not a simple linguistic process. Adapting Jewish concepts into Greek had profound cultural and philosophical implications. The Greek language, with its nuances and philosophical concepts, often required the translators to make choices that influenced the interpretation of the scriptures. For instance, terms related to Jewish law and morality did not always have exact equivalents in Greek, leading to reinterpretations of these concepts. This interaction between cultures was not limited to Judaism. The Septuagint also attracted the attention of Greek philosophers and thinkers who began studying the translated Jewish texts. Although Judaism was a relatively isolated religion, the Greek translation paved the way for dialogue with Greek philosophy, creating an exchange of ideas. The Jews of Alexandria, living between two cultures, used the Septuagint as a way to preserve their faith and identity in a Hellenized environment. The translation allowed them to maintain a connection to their religious roots, even when Greek was their primary language. Furthermore, the Septuagint gave non-Jews access to the content of Jewish scriptures, which would later influence Christianity. However, this fusion of cultures also generated controversy. Many rabbis saw the Greek translation as a dilution of the original teachings. The nuances of the Hebrew language, with its rich symbolism and specific cultural expressions, were not easily captured in Greek. This led some scholars to reject the Septuagint as a legitimate interpretation of the scriptures. Despite these tensions, the Septuagint was widely accepted by Hellenized Jewish communities for centuries. It was only later, with the rise of Christianity and the use of the Septuagint by Christians that it became a point of contention between Jews and Christians. For the early Christians, the Septuagint was essential to their theology and interpretation of messianic prophecies. In the end, the translation of the Septuagint not only allowed the scriptures to be read by a larger audience, but also transformed the way these scriptures were understood and used in the ancient world. Its cultural and philosophical impact was immense, influencing both Jewish and Hellenistic thought and paving the way for the emergence of Christianity. The controversies surrounding the translations. The translation of the Septuagint has sparked numerous controversies over the centuries, particularly due to the changes made during the process of converting Hebrew into Greek. These adaptations often went beyond mere linguistic adjustments, introducing theological nuances that deeply influenced how the scriptures were interpreted, especially within Christianity. One of the most controversial translations involves the prophet Isaiah. In the Hebrew text of Isaiah 7:14, the word Alma means young woman, whereas in the Septuagint, the term was translated as Parthenos, meaning virgin. This small change had a massive impact, as it was used by early Christians to support the doctrine of the virgin birth of Jesus. Another notable example of divergence between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text is the book of Job. In the Septuagint, the text of Job is significantly shorter than in the Hebrew version. Scholars estimate that about 1/6 of the content was omitted in the Greek translation. This raises questions about the sources used by the translators and the editorial decisions made to condense the text. While there is no definitive answer to these discrepancies, it is speculated that the translators may have sought to adapt the literary style of Job to suit a Greek audience, who were more accustomed to concise forms of narrative. These differences were not merely literary issues, but carried theological implications. Many of the alterations made in the Septuagint's translation directly affected the interpretation of biblical prophecies and laws, leading to heated debates between Jews and Christians. For example, the way the Septuagint handled certain terms related to Jewish law drew criticism from rabbis. They argued that the translation introduced Greek philosophical concepts that were not part of the original Hebrew thinking, compromising the integrity of the scriptures. The issue of translation accuracy became even more central as Christianity began to expand. For Christians, the Septuagint represented the Word of God, accessible in Greek, the dominant language of the Mediterranean world. However, many Jews began to distance themselves from the Septuagint, especially as Christianity grew and began using the text to justify its beliefs about Jesus as the Messiah. This tension between Jews and Christians over the Septuagint was one of the factors that led Rabbinic Judaism to prioritize the Hebrew text. Beyond linguistic controversies, the very acceptance of the Septuagint by Christians was viewed with suspicion by Jews. The Greek version of the scriptures was increasingly used to interpret the Old Testament in light of the New Testament, which caused further friction between the two religions. For Christians, the Septuagint confirmed the coming of Christ, while for many Jews, this interpretation distorted the original meaning of the prophecies. Over time, the Septuagint began to be rejected by Jewish authorities in favor of the Hebrew text, known as the Masoretic text, which was consolidated by the Masoretes between the 6th and 10th centuries CE. The Masoretic text became the foundation of Jewish scriptures, while the Septuagint became increasingly associated with Christianity. This distinction between the two texts reflects not only linguistic differences, but also a fundamental theological divergence between the two religions. The rejection of the Septuagint in Judaism was not merely a matter of textual accuracy, but also about control over the interpretation of the scriptures. As Christianity gained strength, Jewish leaders felt the need to reaffirm the authority of the original Hebrew text, preserving their traditions and interpretations. This movement culminated in the marginalization of the Septuagint within Jewish communities, which came to view the Greek translation as unsuitable for religious reading and teaching. Nevertheless, despite these controversies, the Septuagint continued to be widely used in Christian communities. The acceptance of the translation by Christians had a lasting impact on the development of Christian theology and doctrine. Many of the core ideas of early Christianity, especially regarding the fulfillment of messianic prophecies, were based on the reading of the Septuagint. Ultimately, the controversy surrounding the Septuagint reflects the complex interactions between culture, religion, and language. Over the centuries, the divergences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew text have become symbols of the differing worldviews of Jews and Christians, and the debates about the legitimacy of these translations continue to be studied and discussed to this day. Rabbinic rejection and the growing Christian use. As Christianity developed, the use of the Septuagint became increasingly central to the new faith, while Rabbinic Judaism began to reject this translation. Initially, the Septuagint was widely accepted by Hellenized Jews, especially those living outside Palestine, whose primary language was Greek. However, over time, the growing adoption of the Septuagint by Christians led Jewish leaders to distance themselves from it. The early Christians, many of whom were Jewish by origin, viewed the Septuagint as an authoritative source for their theological interpretations. The Greek text, especially passages like Isaiah 7:14, was crucial for justifying the Christian belief in the virgin birth of Jesus. This heavy use of the Septuagint by Christians caused discomfort among the rabbis, who saw the Greek translation as a distorted interpretation of their scriptures. As tensions between Christians and Jews increased, the Jewish community began to move away from the Septuagint, seeking to reaffirm the primacy of the Hebrew text. The rise of Rabbinic Judaism, following the destruction of the Temple in Jerusalem in 70 CE, intensified this shift. The rabbis began to reject the Septuagint, emphasizing the Hebrew text as the legitimate version of the Scriptures. This rejection was driven in part by the fact that Christians were using the Septuagint to reinterpret messianic prophecies, arguing that Jesus was the fulfillment of those promises. For Jews, this interpretation was unacceptable, as it did not align with their view of the Messiah. The growing popularity of the Septuagint within Christianity only heightened the rabbis' suspicion of the translation. The Jewish distancing from the Septuagint was a gradual but decisive process. By the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, the Masoretic text, which preserved the Hebrew version of the Scriptures, began to gain prominence. This text would become the definitive standard in Rabbinic Judaism, solidifying the rejection of the Septuagint among Jews. However, while the Septuagint was progressively abandoned by Jews, its use among Christians continued to increase. For Christian communities, especially Greek-speaking ones, the Septuagint was the official version of the Old Testament. Furthermore, many early Christian writings, including the New Testament, directly cite passages from the Septuagint, reinforcing its authority within Christianity. The conflict over the Septuagint was not merely a dispute over translations, but a battle for the definition of religious authority. For Jews, the Hebrew text represented the original and unaltered tradition, while for Christians, the Septuagint was the confirmation of their messianic beliefs. This division contributed to the growing separation between the two religions. The acceptance of the Septuagint by Christians also had significant implications for the development of Christian theology. Books that were not part of the Hebrew canon, such as the deuterocanonical texts, were included in the Christian Bible. Works like the Wisdom of Solomon and Maccabees played a significant role in early Christian theology, addressing themes such as the immortality of the soul and resistance to oppression. At the same time, the rejection of the Septuagint by Judaism helped shape Jewish identity in a world dominated by Christianity. By distancing themselves from the Greek translation, the rabbis reinforced the importance of studying and preserving Hebrew as a sacred language. This solidified a textual tradition that remains the foundation of Judaism to this day. Thus, the Septuagint, which began as an attempt to make Jewish scriptures accessible to the Greek-speaking world, became a point of contention between Jews and Christians. Its acceptance by Christians and rejection by Jews symbolized the theological divergence that separated the two religions, with repercussions that continue to this day.